I never wanted to be part of this. Hell, I never thought. Oh, no, that's just short-sighted. Of course he was gonna take it this far. I mean, I understand on some levels why he did it. My memories of him and how it happened are just so vivid. The circumstances we were in and the situation surrounding everything, it just. Ugh. I swear, every time I scrutinize the details that ultimately led me to this point, I still can't bring myself to condemn or condone what he did. And I'm honestly not inclined to stop him when he eventually does it again. Not that I even could. Because what happened to Lonnie Campman was a tragedy compounded by an atrocity. What he became and what he ultimately chose to do, he's still very much a victim in his own right. But now, he has become something much more volatile. And wherever he goes, whoever crosses his path, they'll never know the tragic side of his story. They'll only ever know what he's become. And I guess that's unavoidable. After all, Lonnie's story is closely tied to my own. I may be the only one left who can tell that story. And since I don't know if I'll get another chance, I might as well put it out there. But fair warning, this story is not for the faint of heart, especially if you've never experienced real, abject poverty. That's the critical link between me and Lonnie. It's also the primary catalyst for how things played out the way they did. Because for the both of us, we were dealt a pretty terrible hand the moment we entered this world. For me, it was already going in the wrong direction when I was born. I was the third kid of my mentally ill mother, and like my two older siblings, I was not planned. I'm not even sure if I was conceived consensually, if you know what I mean. And honestly, I don't even want to know at this point. I'll just say that my home life was unstable at best and utterly lacking at worst. I spent most of my childhood bouncing between cramped apartments and townhomes, sometimes with aunts, uncles, and cousins, and other times with total strangers. Even at the time, and despite my youth, I knew that none of these living situations were ideal. For me, it was totally normal for the electricity, the water, or the heat to be turned off. It was also normal to go without meals that went beyond candy bars, soda, and popcorn. Hell, I don't think I even lived in a place with hot water or a working toilet until I was 10 years old. And in a situation like that, you can't really do much other than take things day to day. My mother would do odd jobs here and there, but having never graduated high school, finding work was difficult for her. And her mental issues guaranteed that whatever work she got wasn't going to be stable. One time, she actually got fired from a retail store for crying uncontrollably at the end of a 10-hour shift. And whenever she lost a job, it usually meant our housing situation became more unstable. It also became increasingly difficult to get support from relatives, either due to my mother's illnesses or because they themselves lost jobs too. As a result, we would have these extended stretches where we would be homeless. And that's how I eventually crossed paths with Lonnie Campman. I was around 9 years old when we first met. He was just a bit older than me. He, his mother, and his sister were staying at the same homeless shelter. We only noticed each other because we had identical shirts featuring monster trucks. And we quickly bonded over how faded each shirt was and how long it had been since we'd worn clean clothes. I like to think we had a good sense of humor about it. That usually was my way of coping. Make jokes, laugh about it, and just don't give in to despair. And Lonnie had a sense of humor too, but his was darker. He'd still laugh, but only when he needed to lighten the mood. He, more than most, belabored how much it sucked to live in homeless shelters, how awful it was to sleep on cold benches on the streets, or beg for people's pocket change. From time to time, his outlook would get pretty dire. At one point, while we were trying to keep warm during a power outage, he said, Just imagine for a moment what would happen if misery could turn to rage. Imagine how dangerous everyone in this shelter would be. How much we terrify those who prefer we just disappear. I admit, I let myself imagine things like that sometimes. But Lonnie, I don't know. He didn't seem satisfied with just imagining a better life. He harbored serious, genuine anger at the world and everyone in it. And given his upbringing, that's not the least bit surprising. Because like me, he got dealt a terrible hand from the very beginning. Even before he was born, it seemed Lonnie was always going to have something to be angry about. His parents were textbook trailer trash. His words, not mine. His mother was genuine and good-natured for the most part, but she was also hopelessly dependent on others, always needing to be with someone, always needing some kind of validation. And Lonnie's father took full advantage of that. He was a violent, angry alcoholic whose idea of good parenting involved a strategic punch to the gut on a regular basis. Lonnie once told me his earliest memories revolved around his dad beating up his mom. But what made it so much worse was the underlying source of all that anger. Because at one point, his father was a decent man who made a good living working in the lumber industry. Lonnie even said he would look at old photos, see images of his dad happy and sober. He even believed that they depicted a man who didn't have so many reasons to be upset with life. But then, he loses his job the week before his first child is born. He then gets arrested later that same year for selling stolen machine parts. So he's out of work for an extended period, just can't make ends meet as a waitress. As time goes on, they keep getting more desperate, more angry, and more bitter. But Lonnie's dad is the one who really leans into the anger. Being screwed over time and again, being tracked because of his criminal record and lack of opportunities, he couldn't lash out on much, so he lashed out on Lonnie's mom. And when she couldn't protect them, he'd do the same to him and his sister. And when his mother got word that their trailer was being repossessed, they just up and left, knowing his father would go into an unholy rage in search of a victim. Lonnie often recounted that night with vivid detail, saying how they were given less than 15 minutes to pack, put on their coats, and leave. It marked the first night when he and his family had to sleep without a roof over their heads, but it wouldn't be the last. There's a lot more that happened between that night and when Lonnie's family made it to the homeless shelter. But those are not my stories to tell. I'll just say that they learned to survive just like me and my siblings. They learned to live day to day, not sure of where they were going to sleep, what they were going to eat, or even if they would have a roof over their head that night. Lonnie and I even bonded over how we navigated these dark times, from sifting through garbage bins behind restaurants to squatting in unoccupied homes for a night. We also stuck together at school. Despite being in a shelter, we were able to go to public school, but that was still its own challenge. The school we went to was dirty, underfunded, and overcrowded with a lot of rowdy kids our age. And many of them were only a few emergencies away from being as destitute as we were. Despite that, we were still targets. Lonnie and I couldn't really hide the poverty we came from, often wearing the same clothes, unable to afford basic school supplies, and rarely being able to afford a decent lunch. But Lonnie always made sure we never got bullied beyond a certain point. I might have been content to keep my head down, but Lonnie was never afraid to pick fights with anyone who looked down on us. Hell, one time this kid made this joke about how our shirts smelled worse than our breath, and rather than laughing, Lonnie punched him right in the nose, and then he asked them if that helped with the smell. I mean, yeah, that got him in trouble, and yeah, he pretended to apologize, but I could see it in his eyes. He did not regret his actions in the slightest. And I sure as hell never said anything. I mean, why would I? I felt the same way. I just didn't act on it. And I guess that was always the big difference between us. Lonnie was willing to act on his embittered feelings, but I preferred the indirect approach. Yes, my situation was bad, but I did not want to do anything to make it worse. But unfortunately, neither approach succeeded in the long run, because things did get worse, Not all at once, but it became increasingly notable towards the end of high school. It started with these little things, like free lunches at school no longer being free, discounts on school supplies going away, and teachers looking increasingly burned out, having to do multiple roles. I myself knew it was getting bad when I saw one of my favorite biology teachers working as an Uber driver on evenings. We even saw it at the homeless shelters we stayed at. The staff personnel started getting cut. The services and programs that families like ours needed, they either got reduced or disappeared entirely. Now, Lonnie's mother managed to cling to them thanks to her staying employed, albeit as an underpaid waitress. And my mother only got to stick around because of her status as being mentally ill. But the scariest trend, the one that often kept me up at night, was seeing people at the shelter just disappear. It's not like they got out or found a new place to live. At times, they were just there one night and gone the next. In the past, Lonnie and I would often see some of them sleeping on the streets or in tents, but this time, we didn't see anyone. And by the time we were juniors in high school, it became too hard to ignore. Too many people that we knew, people from struggling families just like ours, they were disappearing without a trace, and we had no idea what happened to them. I just didn't want to think about it, but Lonnie had his share of theories. He said it was part of the city's new anti-homeless initiatives. Apparently, too many people were sick of us, sick of seeing us struggle and beg, bringing down property values and disrupting businesses. So they looked for more indirect ways to get rid of us, so to speak. Since I never followed politics, I didn't know what to make of Lonnie's claims. I never thought they were that outlandish, but now I doubt even Lonnie knew how bad it was, let alone how bad it ultimately got. Eventually, our senior year of high school came, which also happened to coincide with an election year. But I noticed Lonnie being really anxious the day after the election in November. We both saw certain people in our school cheering, and others crying, dreading, and looking around anxiously, like they were about to be attacked at any moment. I couldn't tell you much about the politics behind those feelings. I just wanted to keep my distance from it all, focusing on controlling what little I could control. But as it turns out, I didn't control nearly as much as I thought I did. Just a few months after the election, me, Lonnie, and a bunch of other kids got pulled out of class. We found out through some administrators that we might not be able to finish the year or graduate. It wasn't because our grades were bad or anything like that, although mine certainly had room for improvement. But according to the principal, the school district was now coordinating with the federal government on a new program, one that intended to, quote, address families like ours, namely families with unstable housing situations. Now, they framed it as an opportunity, but Lonnie and I could see through the lies. They were kicking us out, plain and simple. We were just too much of a drag on the school, the city, and hell, the world, it seemed. So, on that fateful day, we had to clean out our lockers. When some kid joked about us finally being too broke for public school, Lonnie just flat out punched him in the jaw and knocked out 2 of his teeth. The kid probably could have pressed charges, but he didn't. I think he was too scared at that point. He knew what happened when you picked a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose. But even when we thought we had nothing, we still ended up losing even more. Because later that same week, we found out that the homeless shelter we'd been living in was shutting down. The city was going to demolish it to make room for some condos, aka overpriced housing that only rich people could afford. Some would call it gentrification. I would call it the city's way of telling us outright to get the hell out. But they weren't going to just toss us out onto the streets. Oh no, they arranged for these buses to come and take us to this refuge, as they called it. But that was another lie. It was just this big plot of ugly land outside the city, when it already had become a homeless encampment crowded with tents, porta potties, and whatnot. Whatever you're picturing, I promise it was so much worse. It was so dirty, cramped, and depressing as hell, like a purgatory for everyone not lucky enough to have a home to go to. Sure, there were bus stops and van lots nearby, allowing people to commute into the city for whatever menial jobs they had, and in theory, they could still work and eventually make enough money to get some decent housing. But in practice, I would liken it to playing by the rules of a rigged game of Monopoly. But because Lonnie and I were young, able-bodied, and not strung out on drugs or alcohol, we were expected to help. And we certainly did. Not happily, but we still tried. I mean, what else could we do? This encampment, it was full of people who just had nowhere to go, or people who were old, sick, or just not all there mentally. They needed help, but nobody was going to provide it. The months that followed were really bleak, even by homeless standards. I managed to get a job at some box retail store. It wasn't much, and I may have lied a bit on the application, but it came with access to a shower, a free meal, and some clean clothes. All stuff I just could not turn down. As for Lonnie, he tried to get work too, but his temper and his attitude made that very difficult. For the most part, he focused on just protecting his sister at the encampment, who at that point had become a total mess thanks to drugs and alcohol. But with each passing week, we noticed the encampment getting more and more crowded. Lonnie even began speculating over what might happen when they eventually ran out of room. Would they just bus us all somewhere else? Or would they take more drastic measures? Now, he never said what that entailed, and I was too afraid to contemplate the implications. At the time, my focus was just on getting me, my mother, and my sisters into a better situation. Because we had jobs, we could, with a little time and luck, get into an apartment or a sublease. That was my primary goal. And I thought it was within reach. Then, that night came. That terrible, awful night where my worst nightmares and Lonnie's worst fears took a bold new form. It began when this big storm rolled into the area. Think heavy rain, lightning, and lots of thunder. You know, the kind of weather you don't want to deal with when you're homeless. I actually made it a point to work an extra shift that night. I even begged a coworker to give me their shift, so much so that I promised to clean the bathrooms for the rest of the week. Naturally, he accepted. As a result, I didn't make it back to the encampment until well after midnight, long after the last bus had run its main route. I only managed to make my way back by bumming a ride from this guy who worked the graveyard shift. He was nice enough to drive me to the outskirts of the city. He even gave me some extra ponchos for the rain. But he also left me with this strange warning. Be careful about going in that direction, pal. You don't want to be near that homeless encampment up the road. I hear the mayor has big plans for it. I didn't think much of it at the time. At that point, I'd heard all sorts of comments and rumors about the encampment, but I didn't plan on being there much longer. That's what kept me from overthinking it. So while walking up the road, knowing a long, stormy night and a cramped tent lay ahead of me, I just tried to focus on how close we were to leaving. But as the encampment was coming into view, that's when I heard it. This loud roar of an engine overhead, like some small plane was flying above the storm clouds. I thought that was strange, because planes usually didn't fly that low, especially around areas like this. But then, the next thing I know, there's this blinding flash. At first I thought it was just lightning, but no, this was brighter, hotter, and with real force behind it. Then I heard it. This big, deafening blast, one way too loud to be thunder. And that's when I realized what just happened. It was a bomb. Someone had dropped a bomb on a homeless encampment. The same encampment with my mother, my sister, and Lonnie. For a fraction of a second, I felt this mix of shock and horror, already fearing the worst for my family and friends. But that feeling was quickly muted when the shockwave hit. It was like this wall of air knocking me flat on my back and right into the mud. And while I'm lying there, another explosion follows. Another bomb fell on the encampment. But this one was different. This one resulted in this thick plume of strange greenish smoke. And as it spread out, the rain only seemed to make it thicker. I had no chance of outrunning it. And as soon as I got a whiff, I nearly coughed up my lungs on the spot. I still don't know what it was. I thought it was some kind of poison, like some added measure to make sure that there was nobody left, just in case someone survived the explosion. It was like this extra large middle finger from God, as if I needed a reminder of how little he cared about everyone in that encampment. And in that moment, I gave up. I didn't even try to avoid the noxious gas. I was done, defeated, utterly devoid of what little hope I had left. I wanted it all to end. But it didn't. Not because I found the strength to carry on, but because someone would not let me. After the bombs went off, after the gas cloud dissipated, I heard another noise from the smoldering ruins that had once been a crowded homeless encampment. Despite the lingering fires, despite the noxious gas, someone had survived. Someone had been buried and burned beneath all that death and carnage, but refused to give in. It was Lonnie, but not entirely. I'm still not entirely sure how much of him died in that blast. I'm only certain that enough of him survived to take on this terrifying new form. I only realized this when I heard him yell out from the edge of the encampment. Even through the thunder and the rain, his voice rang out.
It burns!
Somehow managed to stumble to my feet. The gas still has me feeling sick and disoriented, but I'm able to make out this figure emerging from the ruins. From a distance, it still looks human. But as it approaches, I realize it only has a human shape. What was once Lonnie Campman, a scrawny, wire-thin guy with long, messy hair, was now this tall, imposing monstrosity. His body looked like a mix of flesh, mud, and this greenish fluid I still can't identify. And with each step he took, these strange fires followed, like the fires from the encampment were drawn to him somehow. By the time he gets close enough to me, I can see this greenish gas spewing from his body, gas that seemed to fuel the flames around him. That same gas burned me even more. I could feel parts of my skin blister. But as he loomed over me, the air suddenly cleared, and through this human-shaped mountain of mud and flesh, I see a face. I saw Lonnie's face.
Breathe, my friend. It still burns, but only for me.
As I cough and wheeze, I watch the fire and gas around him swirl. It's as if he's controlling them, like the spirits of those from the encampment are now within him, the collective horror of what they endured now residing within his being. I tried to talk to him. I don't even remember how long we just stood there, under the pouring rain, trying to make sense of it all. But eventually, Lonnie extended his monstrous hand.
Come, follow me. I know who did this. They must pay.
I didn't argue. I wasn't in a position to do anything other than what he said. Everyone I knew was gone. I had nowhere to go. And yeah, I admit I wanted to know who was responsible. I wanted to at least see the face of whoever just murdered my family and friends. So I followed Lonnie to the nearest road. He waited for a large truck to drive by. When it stopped, the terrified driver got out and tried to shoot him with a gun. He didn't miss, but Lonnie, he didn't flinch even as the bullet passed through him. And that was more than enough to scare the driver off. He ended up dropping his gun and running back to the city. And once he was out of sight, we both got into the truck. Lonnie, or whatever he was, got into the driver's seat and drove, despite having never driven a truck in his life. In the moment, I was just grateful to get out of the rain and help myself to the snacks the trucker left behind. I didn't know we were going, so all I could do was just sit back and wait, avoiding eye contact with Lonnie as much as I could. I could still sense that he was in pain. I could hear him seething as he drove, his monstrous flesh pulsing with his strange, disgusting hiss. He was angry, but this was a different kind of anger. Lonnie had never been afraid to act on his anger in the first place, but what he was about to do, it was sure to be much more ambitious. Eventually, we get to this neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, and I recognized it immediately. It's called the Picket Enclave, a gated community full of mansions and second homes, basically the polar opposite of a homeless encampment. This was where the rich, the well-connected, and the affluent lived, far away from the bustle of the city, insulated completely from people like me, Lonnie, and our families. It's a place I never thought I'd ever visit, or even be allowed to enter for that matter. But Lonnie, he did not ask for permission. He actually drove the truck straight through the gate, mangling parts of the truck in the process. Things got pretty messy inside the truck, but he didn't care. He just drove the truck as far as it would take him until he reached a very specific house, which also happened to be one of the nicest in the whole neighborhood. But as soon as Lonnie gets out of the truck, a bunch of security people converge on him. They weren't cops, but they were definitely not the kind of people you want to mess with. But they all took one look at Lonnie, and they were terrified. And even though I'm still in the truck at this point, I hear what he says to them.
All of you, leave. This is your first and only warning.
The men exchanged looks. They all have hands on their weapons. I can sense what they want to do. I also can sense what they were trained to do. But I guess they weren't paid enough to deal with something like this. They all just threw their weapons away and ran off into the stormy night. I couldn't see his face, but I could definitely sense Lonnie grinning. I suspect that he was relieved he didn't have to go through the guards, because they were not his targets. Whoever it was, they were inside this big, fancy house. Naturally, I keep on watching, staying inside the truck, afraid to leave, afraid to even talk to what had once been my best friend. Then I actually see the grin on his face. It was even wider than I suspected. And with the rain still pouring, the lightning still flashing, he approached the house. At one point, he stops halfway and just stands at the base of this long driveway, looking up at what might as well have been a palace, especially compared to the shelters and trailer parks that he'd lived in all his life. And even from a distance, I could feel the anger and hatred burning within him. Not gonna lie, after what happened at the homeless encampment, the only home I really had at that point, a part of me shared in that hatred. I mean, these people were living in these big, fancy, spacious homes behind guarded gates. From my perspective, it sent a clear message. They were rich and well-connected, and people like me and Lonnie, they didn't want anything to do with us. They didn't want to see us, they didn't want to know us, they didn't even want to think about us. We just meant so little to them. Hell, we meant nothing to them. So to just erase us from the face of the earth like that, I doubt they lost a moment of sleep over it. And just thinking about that filled me with a hate that, even now, it sickens me. But Lonnie, I don't think that bothered him one bit. He then let out this angry roar before storming into the house, breaking through the front door as if it was made of plywood. That definitely triggered the alarm system in the house. Everyone inside, if they weren't awakened by the truck crashing through the gate, they were wide awake now. Initially, I could only hear the alarms, but they abruptly cut off less than 20 seconds after Lonnie entered. And less than a minute after that, I started hearing screams. Horrible, terrified screams. Some from grown adults, others from terrified children. I also think I heard some gunshots and other loud banging sounds. Whatever was happening inside, there was definitely a struggle. But whatever form it took, Lonnie eventually won. I know this because those louder noises eventually stopped, but the terrified cries did not. Eventually, they started getting louder and louder. At the same time, fires start breaking out all over the house, which really shouldn't have been possible. I mean, this place was built out of brick and stone, but on every floor, I could see bursts of flames erupt, blowing out windows, destroying sections of the roof, and causing entire areas to crumble. Now, I don't know much about fire or burning buildings, but what I was seeing, it was definitely Lonnie's doing. It felt like he was doing to this house what had been done to the homeless encampment. He was just a lot more hands-on, so to speak. Now, initially, I thought the people inside were just going to burn to death, but I guess Lonnie felt that would have been too merciful. Because just before the fire consumed the second floor, the mayor to the city, his wife, and their 4 kids all ran out of the house, still in only their pajamas and looking very scared. They all stumbled back through the pouring rain, falling into the wet mud initially. Then they all turned around and just watched as their home burned. Even from a distance, I could see the expression on their faces. The sorrow, the horror, and the anguish. I already knew that feeling. It was the feeling you got after watching your home get destroyed before your eyes. Now, I admit, I did feel some sympathy for a moment. But then I remembered that these people were rich, and the mayor definitely had connections. I don't doubt for a second they could have easily found another place to live that same night. However, Lonnie thought of that too. Through the flames and the smoke, he emerged from the house, not at all bothered by the destruction. He seemed to have grown even more. He must have stood nearly 11 feet tall at this point. And when he approached the mayor and his family, now soaking wet and consumed by fear, they cried and begged like wounded animals. But Lonnie, he showed no sympathy towards them whatsoever. He just kept grinning with this perverse glee as he loomed over them, like a predator tormenting its captured prey. He seemed to genuinely relish their reaction. I think it actually emboldened him, because what he did next, it went far beyond simply destroying their home.
Stand up!
He made that command with such force, his voice echoed even louder than the thunder. And despite their overwhelming fear, the mayor and his family did as he asked.
Now strip! All of you, down to your bare ass!
They hesitated. I think the mayor and his wife protested. And their oldest child couldn't have been more than 16 years old. But whatever they said, it didn't work. Eventually, all 6 of them stripped out of their pajamas. And it's still pouring rain outside. It's still windy and cold. And the children are doing their best to cover themselves. But Lonnie doesn't seem the least bit bothered. He actually laughs at them as he takes their clothes, sets them on fire, and throws the ashes back towards their burning house. More cries follow. At this point, it's more despair than horror. But that just makes Lonnie laugh even more. It also helps him make the point I think he always intended to make.
There! Now you know how it feels to see your home destroyed, to see everything you own go up in flames, leaving you with nothing!
He laughs again. He laughs and he laughs and he laughs, and the mayor's kids just keep crying and crying. He and his wife keep trying to protect them. They even try to stay close to keep them warm. Lonnie sees this, but shows absolutely no pity. He moves in closer, causing them to cower even more, and with his oversized arms, he grabs the mayor and his wife, tearing them away from their crying children, and holds them up so that they're just a few inches from his face.
But for people like you, this is just an inconvenience. You've got money. You could have a new home to live in tomorrow if you wanted. That's not just a luxury. That's an impossible dream for me and my family. Now, they'll never get a chance because of you. Oh, I wish I could do to you what you just did to my family. But that would be too easy.
I'm not entirely sure what happened next, but while holding them up, Lonnie spewed out this gas from his body. It was thick, green, and misty. And even from far away and through the rain, it smelled terrible. But he seemed to be able to guide it somehow, causing it to form this small cloud around the mayor and his wife's head. For a good 5 minutes, they coughed, cried, and wailed in agony. Their 4 kids watched on, too scared to even cry at this point. The younger ones closed their eyes and covered their ears, and that was probably smart on their part. But smart or not, it didn't change the end result. When the coughing and gasping finally died down, Lonnie just casually dropped the mayor and his wife into the mud. Their kids ran up to them, but it didn't take long before they sensed something very wrong with their parents. I saw the oldest start to panic, holding them up and looking at them anxiously. All 4 kids then turned to Lonnie and yelled at him, but he just shook his head and kept laughing. But he just shook his head and sneered.
Don't worry. Mommy and Daddy are fine. To a point. They just got a long whiff of toxic brain-killing gas. Think lead poisoning, but much more concentrated. They both now have permanent brain damage. Their mental state reduced to a retarded 6-year-old. Hell, they'll be lucky if they can wipe themselves from here on out. Let's see them rebuild their home, their family, and their wealth like this. And before you blame me, just know one thing. I'm only taking from them what I never had a chance to gain.
Lonnie keeps on taunting these kids. As angry as I am about what happened to my family, I could never bring myself to be so callous or cruel. But at that point, what could I do? The 4 kids kept trying to help their parents, but now they seem so broken and helpless, their minds reduced to that of children. All the money, power, and influence they had before, it might as well be a crumbled up piece of paper thrown in the garbage. I can only imagine what that'll mean for those kids. I mean, maybe they have aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Maybe they'll have some kind of protection, the kind that means they'll get new clothes, new toys, and a new home. Or maybe none of that will happen. Maybe Lonnie will just go after them next. Maybe he'll make sure that the 4 of them end up as destitute as we were at that homeless encampment. I honestly don't know, and I'm too afraid to think about it at this point. Because the only reason I'm sharing this story is because Lonnie wants me to. He made that clear to me on that same night. Because after he was done tormenting those kids and their now broken parents, he walked back over to the truck. Now standing nearly 12 feet tall at this point, he just looks at me and smiles. For a very brief moment, it almost looked like the Lonnie I remembered, the Lonnie who smiled so rarely but often for a good reason. I was still too scared to speak, and the loss of my home and family was still too fresh in my mind. But he'd clearly planned for this. From his strange, mud-like body, he gives me this large collection of stuff from the house. There's a nice bit of food from the pantry and fridge, as well as wads of money and jewelry, which I'm guessing he took from the mayor's room. He even gives me a couple of smartphones, which I'm guessing belong to the kids. He doesn't really need to explain it to me, and I honestly didn't want to ask. This was effectively one last act of gratitude to me, his only friend. And since I was completely homeless, broken, alone, I was not in a position to refuse. But before Lonnie left me, before he disappeared into the stormy night, he gave me one last message. A message and a warning to those who would soon know his wrath.
Tell them what happened tonight. Tell them our story. Let them know that no matter where they are, or how safe and secure their cozy homes might be, I am coming for them. I will have my revenge.